I'm Asha Tomlinson, and this is Being Black in Canada. For the next half hour, we'll examine parts of Canada's history you may not be very familiar with. We'll meet some of the descendants of the Black pioneers who helped settle Western Canada. We'll hear why the author of the Book of Negroes felt compelled to tell the story of freed slaves in Nova Scotia. And we ask how what we know or don't know about Canada's history changes how we see ourselves. That's where we begin, with two Windsor, Ontario teachers who are showing students what's missing from their history books. In 2010, Chantel Browning-Morgan developed and taught a course called The History of Africa and Peoples of African Descent. The point? To dismantle myths, challenge stereotypes, and fill in some big gaps. Stefana Jetti now teaches that class. And they both say that the impact of the material on the students is, in many cases, life-changing.
It's very sad to hear what they think it means to be a Black male or a Black female.
Thug.
Ghetto.
Gangs.
Loose.
It's really, really difficult for me to see that.
Every year it was the same thing. I would go home and cry, and I would say, wow, my work is cut out for me.
This is, kind of their perceptions coming into the course of what it means to be Black.
Thief.
Poor.
Drop out.
How can they aspire to reach their full potential if they view themselves in such a negative light?
Morning, Nick. The goal for students is to learn about African history and to learn more about African Canadian history as well.
In our courses, we never really talk about it.
They come into the course thinking Black history started with slavery. That's all they think their history is. When you ask them, tell me about your history. We were slaves. We picked cotton. We sang songs. They can't go beyond that.
I actually thought I wouldn't be that interested in it because I didn't know how deep the history was actually going to be.
So I take them back and we go through ancient Egypt.
We explore several African empires, Mali Empire, the Ghanaian Empire, the Egyptian Empire.
Most of the things in this classroom are surprising.
Just taking them back and really showing, hey, in your DNA is this knowledge, this wisdom from these people.
The most surprising part for me was actually learning about the ancient Egyptians, learning about how they were people with darker skin color. To actually figure out that Black people had a huge involvement in a lot of the basics to civilization now was kind of really empowering for me.
From there, we move on to what's happening today and what we can kind of do about it. And so the kids start to get a grasp of what does it mean to be Black today in Canada.
So for this activity, students had to use the slave trade database online.
I mean, there's a lot of description here. Tara, 26 years old. Just the words, hungry, worried, weak.
Will I ever see my family again? Will I die? The students were essentially giving back some humanity and some identity to those who were aboard the slave ships.
After being freed, you would have thought as Canada as being, a place that you could fight for.
I never knew that there was African Canadians that went to war until this class, and that brought shame to me.
The number 2 construction battalion, it did amazing things back then, and did some things that, aren't necessarily recognized in Canadian history.
We don't get to learn about our history unless it's in this class.
This is a major, general chief of staff, something you would have mentioned in, in April of 1916. In France, in the firing line, there is no place for a Black battalion. No white officer would accept an all-Black platoon. What do you think about those comments?
I kind of thought Canada was more of a neutral country and happy to have anybody, but we do have some bad past with the racism, and I was very surprised to hear what I did.
And in the spring of 2011, Chantel was shocked to receive threats.
They wrote some graffiti about me in the bathroom, and then somebody wrote the N-word on my van, and then there was also a letter sent to the school that threatened to kill Black students. We had police presence. My principal gave me her parking spot, and I could. Part of me felt, am I putting these kids in danger? because I'm so passionate. Am I doing too much? Am I, angering some students? Like, what's this all about? So it was hard. When I would sit and reflect, I thought, man, if I could only get that student in my class, I could change that student.
There's an African proverb about a lion and a hunter. The story of the hunt is never really told until you get the perspective of the lion.
Everyone has a story behind them. I honestly spread the stuff we learn. Like, I tell my friends about it, I tell my parents about it, I tell my siblings.
I really want to encourage all my friends to take one of these classes.
Their definition of who they are and what they can become and what they come from has completely changed.
It makes me feel like I can be anybody I want, to be honest. I could be a lawyer like I wanted to be. I could just do whatever I want, because it's not that I have to follow the stereotype anymore.
It opens my eyes and shows me that just because that's what society puts upon us doesn't mean that we have to fit that standard, and we can become more than that, and that we are more than that.
1 year after the course was introduced, Chantel Browning Morgan was given the Governor General's History Award for Excellence in Teaching. The award acknowledges her passion and the pride students feel when they learn they are a part of Canada's history. From page to screen, the Book of Negroes explores Aminata Diallo's incredible journey from slavery to freedom. Coming up, I speak with author Lawrence Hill about the book's Canadian history. I'm Asha Tomlinson. From best-selling book to blockbuster miniseries, the Book of Negroes shares the sweeping story of one woman's journey to emancipation.
My first winter in Nova Scotia, disease streaked through Birchtown. Nobody had a thing.
Did you truly write those letters?
Yes, I did.
Spell conjugate.
C-O-N-J-U-G-A-T-E.
Move along.
You don't have to leave if you don't
Or you're
want.
dead. I said move!
No one wants you in Nova Scotia. Take our jobs, take our land.
Chronicling Aminata Diallo's time under slavery in the United States and her difficult freedom in Canada. The book is rooted in the real history of this country. We spoke to the book's Canadian author, Lawrence Hill, about why he wanted to tell this story.
Nova Scotia is the site of the oldest black communities in Canada. And indeed, it was one of the only places in Canada that had geographically distinct segregated black communities. In most other experiences in Canada, people of African heritage have been sort of mixed in with other communities. But in the case of Nova Scotia, you have many geographically distinct black communities, and the oldest. Black people have been in Canada since the early 1600s. I mean, it's the first documented slave in Canada as an 8-year-old boy in 1628 in Quebec City. His name is Olivier Lejeune, apparently from Madagascar. The first massive wave of black people in Canada is in 1783, when 3,000 people come in a short 6-month window from Manhattan into the south shores, mostly of Nova Scotia, to become the Black Loyalists. And that totally alters the fabric and the demographics and the life of Nova Scotia. 3,000 black people arriving in a village that didn't exist before, basically. It's a revolution in Nova Scotia's demography and in the racial and political life of Canada.
I am a fair person. I hired the Negroes. I let them work for me. But enough is enough. We have too many of them. They should stay in their own community.
Why do you think, even to this point, there's still so little evidence, content, literature out there about the Black Canadian experience?
I have 5 children, and the youngest is 15, and just the other day I asked her at the kitchen table, has anybody spoken to you ever in school about the history of slavery or desegregation, in Canada?
In Canada, yes.
And she scratched her chin for a minute, said, no, I don't think so. And this is a child who's in school today, who's in grade 10, who's 15 years old, in Hamilton, Ontario, which, by the way, has a black community. So it's not as if it's a vacuum there. And so I think that one of our challenges in Canada is rather than sweeping our uncomfortable history under the rug, to pull the rug up and throw it out the door and look at our history and examine it, dramatize it, talk about it. It's actually less painful if you talk about it than if you pretend it's not there.
You don't know what's here. Don't know what's waiting for them. They just keep coming.
Well, sometimes we have to talk about things because awful things happen that force us back to the conversation. And like it or not, we're in there. Let's think for a minute about the refusal on the part of various American juries to indict white police officers who've been killing unarmed black men. It's pretty hard not to have that conversation, including in families, in schools, and on the streets, in Canada. These issues happen in Canada too. It makes it harder for kind of the smug, satisfied Canadian to claim that we're living in a post-racial world. How can we possibly argue that race is not embedded in the very fabric of our lives in Canada and in the States and elsewhere? So there's lots to learn from current events. These things should be brought up in the classrooms and at home, and people talk on the streets, and so they should. So we can use those moments as springboards. And when we're in pain, what we need, what we look for, are our own stories, our narratives. We all need a story. Who we are, where we come from, who our parents were, where our ancestors came from. And so the Book of Negroes and other works of drama, whether they're fiction or TV, give us stories. And we look to stories for comfort and for calm and for identity and for understanding. And they're especially important in times of crisis.
3 white men, strong and sturdy. 10 pence for a day's work. Now move forward.
Right here.
I'll take you 2 and you. Now I need 5 black bucks, 5 pence a day.
What were the challenges for you finding out about your roots growing up?
Well, my father was an African American and my mother, who's still alive, a white American. They met and married and fell in love in Washington, D.C., which was still totally segregated. You couldn't spend a moment breathing in the United States in the 1940s or 50s without being reminded of your race, whether you were black or white, especially in the South, like D.C. So they met and fell in love and married and wanted to forge a life where they didn't feel that race and racial oppression was being shoved down their throat every second. So they chose Toronto, and they hoped that they could just kind of escape race. And so while they were reminded of race every day of their lives, I grew up in this kind of racial vacuum in which nobody wanted to talk about race. People wanted to imagine it didn't exist. Nobody wanted to sort of examine it or discuss it. And I didn't quite know where to place myself. On one hand, I was black. I came from a family that was partly black, and that much of the white family had discarded my mother when she married a black man anyway. But in Toronto, in the 60s, in Don Mills, it was as if people either didn't want to recognize it at all, or would suddenly come up and slug you with a racial insult. It was hard to find my footing and figure out where I was, and that's a good thing, because that crucible of ambiguity drove me to write and read, to figure out who I was and to forge a life for myself where I could feel comfortable and grounded. So reading and writing became my way of solving the issue of my own identity.
From April to November, I helped register thousands of blacks who were leaving New York.
Joe Mason.
One of the great things about television is it reaches a far wider audience than literature. The Book of Negroes is a literary novel. Only so many Canadians would normally read a literary novel, but if TV can sort of help that story jump the gap and attract a wider swath of Canadians, so much the better. That means perhaps millions of people will be talking about it instead of a few thousand. So it's a great way to stimulate people about history, and it's the beginning. So you watch the miniseries and then you want to learn more.
Just ahead, we'll meet the descendants of the brave black pioneers who helped settle Canada's West and find out how they're preserving their family's legacy. Welcome back to Being Black in Canada. We're looking at how history informs how we see ourselves. Next, we meet 3 black pioneer descendants, including a mother who is making connections through the power of song.
Why don't you ring that hammer? Hammer, why don't you ring that hammer? The music, it really does span history itself. So it's different sounds that are key to certain eras. There's certain sounds and vocal stylings and musical styles that are also key to different areas and regions. So if you understand what these things mean, it can literally place you back within a cultural context at certain times and places, and bring it alive in more of a heartfelt way.
Janetta Jamerson, Cheryl Fogo, Leander K. Lane. Their great-grandfathers were part of the so-called Black 1000, a group of African Americans fleeing segregation in the southern U.S., the Jim Crow laws of the early 1900s.
Black people in Oklahoma then endured lynchings at astonishing numbers. Many black towns were burned to the ground. There was a real uptick in the amount of violence that they endured. The people who had created the state of Oklahoma wanted them to get a very clear message, which is that they were not going to enjoy the same rights as white people in the territories.
I mean, after slavery was abolished, of course, there was a lot of promises made and a lot of, promise we felt in our hearts, of course, only to be extremely disappointed.
Then the call for Americans to settle in the Canadian prairies.
The government literally took out ads. They took out ads, radio spots, posters. It went all down into the States. They had ambassadors go down, spreading the word, calling for immigration to Western Canada.
There were hundreds and hundreds, more than 1,000 ultimately, that believed this was, a preordained destiny. So they got on trains, they got in wagons, they sold what they couldn't bring with them, but they loaded what goods they could bring onto trains, and they made the journey together. Some went to Winnipeg, some went to Edmonton, some went to Calgary, Saskatoon, Regina, but most of them went as far north as they could get. It was almost as though they wanted to get as far as they could from what they had left behind.
All these little green squares indicate where a black farmer had his homestead. So my great-grandfather settled here.
This is the only photo Leander has of his great-grandfather, Julius Caesar Lane. Born a slave in 1850, free at the age of 15, and a farmer by trade. Later in life, at 60, with family in tow, he traveled to Maidstone, Saskatchewan.
I myself, at the age of 60, could not imagine myself moving into another country 1,000 miles away with a whole family. He had over 10 kids at the time, and starting over. I mean, to me, this was just a tremendous feat.
Put that trust into my gallows. About 1915, though, there was a pushback. The tide really turned against us, and there was a growing movement and call to ban any further Black American immigration, and it really did effectively kill it around 1915.
I found people who don't believe it when I've told them the story about the government writing on official letterheads that blacks were not welcome in the country.
They were very surprised to learn that the Ku Klux Klan was also active here. In combination with the terrible weather, they didn't find it to be the nirvana that they had been looking for.
Still, they stayed and forged communities of their own. But their history and traditions never made it into mainstream Canadian textbooks.
I learned absolutely nothing in school about the Black pioneer experience. Zero.
I didn't know much about my family history growing up.
Their attempt at diversity and inclusion was this one book. The teacher would be at the front and reading out the textbook, and everyone would be sitting there reading along quietly at their desk. And I mean, it was just full of the N-bomb, and everyone would turn and look at you. And, of course, it was about slavery, and that was the only part of our history that mattered in their eyes. I've talked to numerous teachers, when they sprang this book on my kids and tried to just let them know, there's another way to look at this. There's more to the story than this.
Junetta, Cheryl, and Leander have spent much of their lives filling in the blanks, highlighting Black Canadian leaders like John Ware, a legendary cowboy who helped shape Alberta's ranching industry.
I love this photo of him. He would have been considered a successful rancher even if he had not been Black. He had a larger-than-life personality. People were incredibly drawn to him, I think, because he was a very centered, confident person, comfortable with himself, despite the fact that he was almost certainly enslaved for a part of his life. I really don't understand why every Canadian doesn't know who John Ware is.
And there are a lot of Canadians who don't know the story of Saskatchewan's Shiloh Baptist Church, a building Leander Lane has worked very hard to restore, a lasting symbol of the community that would gather inside these old walls.
In most communities, the church, the Black church, was the first building erected. They weren't allowed to have organizations, they weren't allowed to have schools, but they were allowed to have a church.
And right beside the church, a cemetery where the Shiloh people were laid to rest, with towering spruce trees planted at the head of each grave, a traditional tribute. Janetta Jamerson passes on her history through singing timeless songs of pain, hope, and survival, and by teaching her own history lessons around the dinner table at home.
Who is this? You have any idea?
I think it's Grandma and Grandpa Henderson.
It is. This is Grandma Janetta's parents.
When people try to challenge, be like, oh, put like us in a stereotype, in like a bracket of what we're supposed to be, we know who we actually are. We know our history, we're proud of our history.
Oh, by and by.
From family legacy to pop culture to classroom curriculum, across this country, people are making sure the stories of Black Canadians are being told. Because for them, being Black in Canada is as much about where we came from as where we're going. I'm Asha Tomlinson. Thanks for watching.
On a ring,